Joining me once again on the show today is Evan DeFilippis, who's a data journalist for the new gun violence magazine, The Trace, and also co-founder of the website Armed with Reason. There's a really interesting new article, Evan, that you guys have up called Gun Rights Advocates Claim Criminals Don't Follow Gun Laws. Here's the research that shows they're wrong. And I like this because it attacks a very specific talking point we hear from the more guns in more places side all the time, which is what's the point of any gun laws? What's the point of regulations? Because by definition, criminals won't follow the laws, and thus it doesn't really matter what the laws are. You've broken this down into a number of component parts. Talk to us about your sort of first investigation into this and what you generally turned up.
Well, thanks for having me back on the show, David. Really appreciate it. So basically, the impetus behind this article was to sort of challenge this common refrain among gun advocates. There's sort of a tendency to transform policy debates into bumper sticker slogans. We've all heard things like "guns don't kill people, people kill people." When you outlaw guns, only the outlaws have guns. And so there's this other common refrain, which is that criminals don't follow laws, and therefore gun control can only hurt law-abiding citizens. So as you mentioned in the beginning, right? It's absurd on its face. Why have any laws at all? That murderers, thieves, rapists, they rarely follow laws that prohibit murder and theft and so on and so forth. So the first way that we challenge this is by just noting what should seem sort of obvious on its face, which is that criminals routinely respond to incentives. Criminals do, in fact, respond to laws, even if the most hardened criminals don't. And sort of one of the ways that we attack this that's rather intuitive is to just look at the way that traffic laws govern behavior. I mean, no one would advocate not having stop signs or red lights based on the notion that people who are really committed to running red lights are going to do so anyway, right? So, and clearly traffic laws have prevented a tremendous number of automobile fatalities and so on. So there are clear reasons for having laws because they do change the incentives that criminals confront. And just as it's true with traffic laws, it's also true with gun laws. And we investigate a lot of the instances in which gun laws do empirically reduce crime.
And I'd love to hear from you on a couple different points what you turned up. I mean, one is that we can sort of intuitively know that, okay, fine, somebody who is going to have a gun illegally is going to figure out a way to get a gun. But it would seem to me that when you limit the number of guns sort of flowing through the system, you do make it more difficult for someone willing to get a gun on the black market to get such a gun. And you actually looked into that, how the flow of guns in the gray market is affected by the laws that are passed.
So that's right. There's this really fantastic research that was recently conducted by Dr. Cook at Duke University and some of his colleagues. And what he did was he conducted research with gang members, he conducted interviews with them in Chicago. And what he found was that Chicago, which has extremely strict gun control, including prohibition of certain classifications of weapons, high capacity magazines, so on and so forth, these regulations directly influence the prices that criminals confronted in secondary black markets. So, for example, he mentions in an interview that one gang member reported paying something like $50 for 10 bullets of a Beretta semi-automatic. And this is 50 times what the cost would be had the criminal had access to what it would be on a standard private market. And the interview lists a tremendous number of different, challenges that criminals face as a result of regulations on the primary market. One criminal, for example, mentioned that because Chicago gun laws were so strict, the majority of gang members who want to get their hands on a gun simply go to Indiana or Mississippi. One gang member flat out admitted to just going to southern states, getting official gun licenses in southern states, purchasing guns legally, and then taking them back to Chicago and selling them in the black market. So what Cook revealed was that, contrary to popular belief, although it is the case that the most hardened criminals won't follow laws, criminals are deterred in a large part because of the sort of price hikes that they face regulations in the primary market.
All right. And then the other one I want to talk about is background checks. And again, sort of similar logic is what's at least attempted by those who are in favor of more guns in more places, which is stricter background checks are only going to impact those who are willing to subject themselves to the background check system and get a gun legally. Same logic. If you're going to get the gun to commit a crime or illegally, the specific nature of restrictions on background checks is not going to affect you in any way. But it turns out that background checks do have an impact on illegal gun ownership.
Exactly. And there's a couple of ways that we can know this. The first is to evaluate, just look at federal Brady background checks. And sort of the simplest way to know that background checks are doing something, at least on the federal level, is that from 1994 to 2012, something like 2.4 million federal firearm applications, it's about 1.6%, have been denied, which means that even after the implementation of federal background checks, criminals were still going to federal vendors of guns and trying to get a gun, even though they knew that they were a prohibited person. So at least in sort of the most superficial way possible, we know that there is some rejection of prohibited persons coming back. And then, however, there have been much more sophisticated evaluations demonstrating that background checks do decrease the likelihood that a criminal is going to obtain guns. Probably the most persuasive come from Johns Hopkins University, conducted by Dr. Webster and his colleagues. And the first study looked at this Missouri law that was repealed in 2007. And this law required any individual who wanted to purchase a gun to show a permit, and that permit itself was contingent on passing a background check. Well, when this law was repealed in 2007, it led to a rather immediate increase in 14% in the homicide rate, which meant something like, between 49 and 68 murders a year, simply as a result of repealing this law. And then a second study conducted by the same people evaluated a law in Connecticut in 1995. And this law was pretty similar to the law in Missouri. It required individuals had to show a permit prior to obtaining a gun. And what they found was that there was a 40% reduction as a result of this 1995 law compared to what would have happened in the absence of the law. And there was an appreciable decrease in suicides as well. And perhaps the most interesting thing was there was not a concomitant increase in the number of homicides committed by weapons other than guns. So this is a common talking point among gun advocates, that if criminals don't want to commit a crime with a gun, they can simply turn to a knife or what have you to commit the same crime. But what Webster studies found was that there was no such substitution effect.
Evan, did you see the recent study that was completely obvious and intuitive in terms of what it uncovered, which is that there's a correlation between a higher homicide rate in states with more relaxed gun laws and a lower homicide rate in states with stricter gun laws? Did you see that recently?
Right. There's a couple of, I'm not sure exactly what study you're referring to, but there's a couple of studies that all point to similar ideas. There was a study conducted by Dr. David Hemingway at the Harvard School of Public Health.
That's the one.
Okay, yeah. So basically, from what I understand of the study, what he did was he looked at homicide data in terms of firearm homicide and aggravated assault, different types of crime, violent crimes that are committed with firearms, and he just ran regressions. And what the outcome of the study was, as you mentioned, the rather intuitive result was that states with weaker gun laws and higher levels of gun ownership were strongly associated with increases in violent crimes that are committed with guns and homicides that are committed with guns. And similarly, there wasn't a substitution effect. So these were net increases in homicide.
So what I wanted to ask you about in general with that is when we did that story, a lot of the reaction that we got from the sort of pro-gun side was two general ideas. One was you're looking at state level data, but you should really consider that within some of those strict gun law states, you have individual cities with very, very high gun crime rates, Chicago being an example of that. And then the other sort of general response we got from the pro-gun crowd was that overall, we've seen the crime rate go down in the United States, so that there's this sort of arbitrary delineation on a state by state basis, and sort of a desire to write off the results as far as that goes. What's the right way to sort of synthesize those talking points, and how can we think about that more accurately?
So there's a lot of complexity in that. The basic gist of it is that it's even if it is the case that crime is going down, there's no strong evidence at all to suggest that the force that is driving those decreases in crimes are increases in the gun ownership rate. For starters, there is no strong evidence that gun ownership is even increasing at all. Even if the total number of guns is increasing, what research shows is that it is among people who already own guns. So you have a couple of collectors who have an arsenal of weapons, and they continue to purchase more and more guns. So the only way that gun crime and violence could be decreasing is if more people were getting guns who never had guns and were perhaps carrying these in public. Well, we don't see that. There is not an actual increase in guns, and there also is not a decrease in crime as well. I mean, this Hemingway study that you referenced showed that when you analyze it by the state level, more guns leads to more homicides. There is extremely robust research showing that more guns leads to more suicides and accidents and of this nature. And even if it is the case that there are, a couple of violent cities that are driving increases in crime, the evidence shows that the reason that those cities are driving crime is largely due to the fact that there are a heavy concentration of guns in those areas. So Chicago, even in spite of its high levels of gun regulation, the research shows that their violence is fueled by the availability of guns because it's surrounded by neighboring states with weak gun laws. I mentioned Indiana, for example, and there's trafficking that goes into Chicago. So basically, no matter what your unit of analysis is, states, cities, you can look at aggregate national data, more guns causes more homicides, suicides, and accidents. And there's very little evidence to suggest otherwise.
Let me remind everybody, the new gun violence magazine is called The Trace. We've been speaking with a data journalist from The Trace, Evan DeFilippis. I'm on the mailing list for The Trace. A lot of very, very interesting work being done there. Evan, thanks as always for being on.